we're going to be talking about how to write a chord progression that sounds good and then how to solo over it and improvise in a way that sounds good. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Now, the first thing when it comes to writing this chord progression that people need to understand is that for the most part, the way that we're going to make a chord progression sound good is we want that chord progression to fit within a key. Now, of course, there are definitely lots of chord progressions that sort of break the rules a little bit, so to speak, where they change keys, or they may even just have one chord within the chord progression that's not within a key. That's a little bit more complicated to get into, so we're just going to stick to writing chord progressions within one key because this is the easiest way to get started. Now, I've made a lot of videos before on how to figure out the chords that are in keys, but this is going to be a quick review. So in this video, we're going to be writing in the key of D major. So first step to finding all the chords that are in the key that we can pick our chord progression from is we need to know the names of the notes in the key. So in this case, the names of the notes, if you look there on the left, are D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, and C sharp. So if we know the names of the notes that are in the key, we pretty much should also know all of the chords that are in the key. Because if we know this chord formula, which I've talked about in other videos, it's very simple to just basically plug it in to those notes that we have there. So the chord formula for a major key to finding all the chords is the one chord is always a major chord. So D major. The 2 chord is a minor chord. So you take that second note. Oh, I see that second note's E. So let me just make an E minor chord, right? So the 2 chord's E minor. And then the 3 chord, well, the third note is F sharp. So the 3 chord's going to be F sharp minor. The 4 chord, well, the 4th note is G. So the 4 chord is going to be G major. And just in case you didn't realize this, if the numbers are uppercase, that means major. If the numbers are lowercase, that means minor. And then lastly, you see here this the last one there, the 7. That one actually is what's called diminished. So that's something to keep in mind. Sorry for not clarifying that right this second. So the 4 chord is going to be major. And 5 chords also going to be major. So 4 is going to be G major, 5 is A major. So I'm basically just playing bar chords right now, by the way, because this is how we're going to play the chord progression once we write it. So G major, A major. Of course, there's other ways to play these chords. And then the 6th chord is going to be B minor. Why? Because the 6th note is B, and we see that the 6th chord in a key is supposed to be minor, so we turn into B minor chord. And then actually the 7th chord is going to be C sharp diminished. So a lot of times when we're talking about like pop progressions and stuff like that and more rock stuff, it's pretty rare to see that 7 chord. There are cases, but for right now, we're not going to pay too much attention to that 7 chord. We're going to be focusing mostly on the 1 to the 6 chord, okay? So once we know that, okay, we have all these chords to select from. Now it's just a matter of essentially almost randomly picking some of those chords out of there. And we know they'll all sound good together. Why are they going to sound good together? Because they all come from the same set of notes. And by the way, if you look up there, that that fretboard diagram, that has all of the notes in the key of D major laid out for you all across the entire fretboard. So that's really important to know for both playing all different kinds of chords and then also soloing later. So let's get into writing a chord progression, and we're going to actually record it on the software Logic, which is what I use for writing and recording music. Okay, so again, there we have all the chords written out just so that you can have them for your reference. So I'm just going to kind of randomly pick some chords here. And I'm going to do so by actually thinking more of the numbers first, okay? So let's take the 4 chord. So I'm just going to write here 4. So the 4 chord happens to be a G, of course. Let's take the 6 chord. So that would be, let's write 6 there, B minor. Notice I don't even necessarily know what this is going to sound like yet, but I bet you it's probably going to sound pretty good. So we got the 4, then the 6, then let's go ahead and play the 3 chord. So that's F sharp minor if you look above there. And then finally, let's go to the 1 chord. Why not? Let's go all the way down to the 1 chord. So the 1 chord is going to be a D major. So let's see what that chord progression sounds like. First of all, just with the guitar. So we got G, B minor, F sharp minor, D, G, B minor, F sharp minor, D. So I like that chord progression. Let's go ahead and record it here on our software. Okay, so now we have actually a loop of that chord progression going here. So let's listen to what we got so far. So you see how easy that was. All of a sudden now we have a basis to either write a song on. If you're someone who, you know, sings and writes lyrics, you can start writing a song over that actual chord progression. Or in our case, we're going to jam out, we're going to solo over this chord progression. Okay. So it actually sounds really good. And I didn't even necessarily know it was going to sound like beforehand. By the way, I kind of did because of something called ear training. But anyway, that's a whole nother topic. You don't need to know what it sounds like. I just know they're going to sound good because they're chords that fit in the same key. All right, so let's add one more thing to this backing track before we actually solo over it. We want to put some bass on it, okay? So typically what happens if you are in a band and you want the bass player to play something over a chord progression, or actually technically under the chord progression, you want the bass player to play the root notes of the chords. So basically, if you are just playing like a G chord, well, guess what? The bass player is going to play a G. If I play this G chord, the bass player is also going to play a G. Do. It's the lowest note, like if I'm playing a bar chord, that lowest note. And then same thing with the B minor. The bass player can play other notes for sure that are in the key, but like right when that chord changes, the bass player is going to want to hit the root note of that chord. It's like G, and then B, and then F sharp, and then D. So that's super duper important for a bass player. And by the way, bass players tend to be really good at knowing what the actual notes are in different chords in the key because of this. Like they can't just sort of rely on shapes. They actually have to play the actual notes from the chords. So let's go ahead and record a bass line really quick. Super simple. All I'm going to do is literally just play the roots of each chord and just add a rhythm to it that fits with the chord progression. All right, so there we go. We got our bass recorded. Let's actually turn that rhythm guitar down a little bit because it's kind of loud. And let's turn that bass up a little bit more and see what this sounds like. There, that's a bit more balanced now. So now we can hear that bass nice and full, and the rhythm guitar shouldn't get in the way of our lead guitar. So now let's jump into actually soloing over this chord progression, okay? And we're gonna go from a basic strategy to a more advanced strategy. So let's just test, by the way, how this is gonna sound. All right, Excellent. So we're pretty balanced here. You can hear clearly the lead guitar over the other things that are going on in the background. So there you go. Now we have a loop set up and we are ready to jam over this thing. And by the way, I did I pre-picked this little drum loop that's on there just for the sake of time. Okay. So strategies for soloing. So the first sort of simple strategy is to just play the scale. I know that this chord progression is in the key of D. It's a 4-6-3-1 progression in the key of D. So that means literally any of these notes will work over the chord progression. And by the way, the most important thing actually, but I know that we just talked about notes right now, the most important thing is to make sure you're playing good rhythms, okay? So I can play all these notes right, but if I don't play with good rhythm over this thing, it's not going to sound good. It's going to sound like I'm playing poorly. So what I would do if I were you is both check out playing all of these notes in the key on one string at a time. Go all the way up each string. As far as your guitar goes, I didn't go quite all the way up, but it's the same thing once you get past the 12th fret. So I really, really think it's important to know one string at a time because then you can play like nice slides and stuff like this. Like, so let's check this out. So all I'm doing there is I'm not really, thinking too much into it. I'm just trying to randomly play notes and just make sure that they fit in that D major scale. There's also, by the way, if you're familiar with the 5 major scale positions, which actually I don't think I've made a video on. I'm going to have to make a video on that because it's just too complicated to get into right this second, but you can divide all these notes in the key into different position patterns. For example, like this. So those two strategies for looking at the scale are both super important, okay? Like the one string at a time, completing the entire fretboard, and then also having your position patterns down. So let's see, I'm just gonna randomly think of notes in the scale. I'm gonna try to turn my brain off to any other sorts of approaches, and let's just see what happens soloing over this backing track. Of course, I was playing a lot of the 16th note subdivision over there, by the way. Let's talk about that rhythm for a second. So the tempo of this track is like 1, 2, 3, 4. So I was playing a lot of like a 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and. Of course, that requires a little bit more technical capability. So if you're not comfortable doing that, of course, I know a lot of you may not be, stick more with 8th notes. So like 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then quarter notes too, just 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and actually a lot of times that's probably more appropriate, if I'm being honest, to play. Sometimes I get carried away with playing lots of notes. Leave a comment, by the way, telling me how I have no feel in my playing or whatever, because I played a lot of notes. I know people like to do that whenever people play fast. But anyway, so just playing the scale, okay? Playing the scale is a good option. And by the way, in parentheses, we could actually have the pentatonic scale. So the pentatonic scale is for major, if you take away actually the fourth and the seventh note. So in this case, taking away all the G's and all of the C sharps, because the G is the fourth note in the scale and C sharp is the seventh note. So let's see. I'm going to see if I can take away all of these. So all G's gone. And then all C sharps are also going to be gone. So now we're actually left with the pentatonic scale, what we call the D major pentatonic scale. Now, this is another thing I got to do a video on, because there's actually 3 different pentatonic scales that you can find in the key of D. You can find D major pentatonic. It's basically based on the 1, the 4, and the 5. So you can find D major pentatonic. You can also find G major and A major pentatonic. You can actually derive those from all of the notes in the key. So let's just see what it sounds like actually if I use that approach really quick. So you see that there's like a little bit of a different vibe to it, even though it's all like, it's just coming from the same notes, particularly leaving out that fourth and that seventh, skipping over those notes, gives it like a different character. By the way, one extra tip when you're thinking about the scales is try to play some wider intervals too, okay? Don't always play everything stepwise, like just going in order, you know, from C sharp to D to E to F sharp to G to A. A lot of times that's what people do, and that's what lends them to sounding like they're playing scales all the time, and they're just running scales. Well, because you're playing it like this the whole time. I mean, that's okay for a little bit, but, you know, try skipping from one string to another. Now, all of a sudden, that does not sound like you're running a scale, because you got some bigger intervals, some 6, some 7ths in there, you know, playing from D to C sharp, and then A, and then a B up here. It's very simple, actually. I'm just thinking, hey, let me not play all the notes in the scale in order stepwise. Let me add some wider interval jumps in there. And then the next step to me, which is the most important once you've got this idea of just soloing in the key down, is to solo with arpeggios. So this is the part that takes a little bit more work to practice on every given chord progression that you take a look at, but it's super worth it because you end up getting the arguably like most perfect result every time. So what's an arpeggio? It just means the notes that are in the chords, okay? So for example, we take the first chord, G, okay? We know that actually if we go back up here, let's look at the notes. We can find all of the notes that are in a chord by taking the first note that's in the chord. So in this case, G. Okay, we're looking at the G major chord. That's the first chord of the progression. And we're going to skip the next note after that and take this one. So we skipped A, and we took B, and then we're going to skip C sharp, and we're going to end up having to go back to the beginning here to D. Okay, so G, B, and D, those are all the notes that are in a G chord. So now if I go back over here and take a look at my scale chart up here, I can see like, oh, look, here's a G here on the 4th string, 5th fret. Here's a B and here's a D, or here's a G, a B, and a D, or here's a G, B, and a D. So any of those G's, B's, and D's, I want to know those really well so that I can always land on those notes and be able to nail the chord changes. So I'm actually just for a second going to loop only that G chord. So now here, look, check this out. Every time I land on one of those notes, they work perfectly because they're the notes that are actually in the chord. So I would want to be able to play through all the possible different arpeggio combinations that I can find of all the chords in this progression. So I would look at all my G chords all over the entire neck. And if you've not been familiar with this idea, make sure you check out my video called How to Learn Major Triads on the Guitar the Right Way. I would be learning all those G major arpeggios, all of the B minor arpeggios, all of the F sharp minor arpeggios, and all of the D major arpeggios. You got to know all of those, and then practice playing a solo with only the arpeggios. So let's see what a solo would sound like with only the arpeggios over this chord progression. And then finally, the master overall approach that you want to be able to get to, master overall approach, is that you want to be able to use both those strategies, using all the notes in the key and then also the arpeggios just to be able to freely solo over the chord progression. So now I'm just going to solo. I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm going to be using some of the arpeggios. I'm going to be using the scale. And when I'm using a combination of those two, I'm going to try to land on one of those arpeggio notes every time the chord changes. If you don't do it perfectly, that's okay. The most important part at the end of the day is your ears and making sure you're playing what you think sounds good. If you think a non-chord tone sounds good over one of the chords, then go for it, because actually, just because you're playing a note that's not in a chord over a chord doesn't mean that's necessarily going to sound bad. It could still sound very, very good. But the arpeggio notes are really, really important because that's where we know it's guaranteed to sound good. So if you want to learn how to master the guitar fretboard so that you can learn how to find all the notes that are in any key and then write your own chord progressions and be able to find all of the chords like I was talking about all over the entire guitar fretboard in any key and any chord so that you can actually use the chord tones to play your solo and implement all these strategies, make sure you head on over to Jamsville.com right now and check out the Jamsville GPS Fretboard Fundamentals course. Also, check the link in the description below for the Jamsville merch store so you can get an awesome Jamsville t-shirt just like this one. Also, make sure you check out my music on Spotify. I just dropped a new single. The link to it is in the description down below. Also, make sure you check out my favorite guitar picks, which I used in this video. They're called the Dan's Guitar Store Precision Pick. They have the best grip that I've ever felt on any pick, and on top of that, I absolutely love the edge for picking itself. It has this really nice beveled edge that cuts through the strings like a hot knife through butter. Make sure you subscribe and hit the like button. And until next time, listen, learn, and jam.